At the wedding, my new husband slapped my son and said, "You're such a nuisance." Sarah, a 58-year-old widow living in the quiet town of Havenwood, Connecticut, had never expected to find love again. After losing her husband, David, to a heart attack 5 years earlier, she'd resigned herself to a life of quiet contentment, filled with gardening, volunteering at the local library, and spending time with her 10-year-old son, Ethan. Ethan was a sensitive, thoughtful boy with a slight stutter that sometimes surfaced when he was nervous or excited. He'd been deeply affected by his father's death, and Sarah had devoted herself to providing him with a stable and loving home. They were a close-knit pair, their bond strengthened by the shared loss they'd endured. Then, she met Mark. It was at a town fair, a summer evening filled with the scent of popcorn and the sounds of laughter. Mark was charming, handsome, and seemingly attentive. He was a successful businessman, recently relocated to Havenwood from New York City, looking for a slower pace of life. He swept Sarah off her feet. He showered her with compliments, flowers, and romantic gestures. He seemed genuinely interested in her life, in Ethan. He took them on weekend trips, bought Ethan expensive gifts, and promised them a future filled with happiness and security. Sarah, caught up in the whirlwind romance, felt like a teenager again. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be desired, to be swept away by passion. She ignored the little voice inside her that whispered caution, the voice that told her it was all happening too fast. Her friends, while happy for her, expressed some reservations. "He seems a little intense," Sarah, her best friend, Carol, had said. "Are you sure you're not rushing into things?" Sarah had brushed off their concerns, assuring them that Mark was the one. She was convinced that she'd finally found her happily ever after, a second chance at love and companionship. Within 6 months, Mark proposed. Sarah, blinded by love and the promise of a secure future, accepted. Ethan, while initially hesitant about this new man in their lives, seemed to warm up to Mark, especially after receiving a new video game console and a promise of a trip to Disney World. There were a few red flags, moments that gave Sarah pause. Mark could be controlling, demanding her attention and subtly criticizing her friends and her way of life. He'd once made a disparaging remark about Ethan's stutter, calling it annoying. But Sarah had dismissed these incidents as minor flaws, as the quirks of a strong-willed personality. She was so focused on the positive, on the dream of a perfect family, that she overlooked the warning signs. She was so eager to believe in the fairytale that she ignored the cracks in the facade. She was, in retrospect, incredibly naive. But she was also desperately lonely, and Mark had filled a void she hadn't realized was so vast. The wedding was planned quickly, a lavish affair at a local country club. Sarah felt like she was living in a dream she desperately didn't want to wake up from. The wedding day dawned bright and sunny, a perfect reflection of Sarah's optimistic mood. She felt beautiful in her ivory gown, a sense of youthful joy bubbling up inside her. Ethan, dressed in a miniature tuxedo, looked handsome and a little overwhelmed by the grandeur of the occasion. The ceremony was held in the country club's rose garden, overlooking a picturesque lake. Sarah walked down the aisle on the arm of her brother, her eyes fixed on Mark, who stood waiting for her at the altar. He looked dashing in his tailored suit, a confident smile on his face. The ceremony was traditional, filled with vows of love and commitment. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she promised to love Mark for better or for worse, in sickness and in health. She meant every word. Ethan, as the ring bearer, performed his duty with a nervous solemnity. He stumbled slightly as he approached the altar, his stutter momentarily surfacing as he handed the rings to Mark. Mark, instead of offering a reassuring smile, frowned slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Sarah noticed it, but quickly dismissed it as pre-wedding jitters. The reception was a lavish affair, with hundreds of guests, a live band, and a seemingly endless supply of food and champagne. Sarah felt like she was floating on air, surrounded by well-wishers, basking in the glow of her newfound happiness. She danced with Mark, with her brother, and with several of her friends. She noticed that Ethan was spending most of his time with his cousins, seemingly a little shy and overwhelmed by the crowd. She made a mental note to spend some time with him later, to make sure he was okay. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere became more boisterous, fueled by alcohol and celebratory energy. Mark, who had been drinking steadily, became increasingly loud and assertive. He dominated conversations, interrupted people, and seemed to crave the spotlight. Sarah noticed a change in his demeanor, a subtle shift towards arrogance and impatience. He made a few off-color jokes that made her uncomfortable, and he seemed to dismiss her concerns with a wave of his hand. She tried to tell herself that he was just letting loose, that he was simply enjoying his wedding day. But a nagging feeling of unease began to creep into her heart. She felt a flicker of doubt, a shadow of the little voice that had warned her about rushing into things. She saw Ethan standing alone near the dessert table, looking lost and a little sad. She excused herself from Mark and went to her son, putting her arm around him. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked. Ethan nodded, but he didn't meet her eyes. He seemed unusually quiet, withdrawn. "Are you having fun?" she pressed gently. Ethan shrugged. "It's okay," he mumbled. Sarah felt a pang of guilt. She'd been so caught up in her own happiness that she'd neglected her son's needs. She resolved to make it up to him, to spend more time with him, to reassure him that he was still her priority. Little did she know that the evening was about to take a devastating turn, a turn that would shatter her illusions and change her life forever. The band was playing a lively tune, and the dance floor was packed with guests. Sarah was chatting with Carol, her best friend, feeling a momentary reprieve from the growing unease she'd been experiencing. Ethan approached them, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. He tugged on Sarah's dress, trying to get her attention. "Mommy," he began, his stutter prominent. I spilled some juice." Sarah knelt down, her concern immediately focused on her son. "It's okay, sweetie," she said soothingly. "It's just an accident. Where did you spill it?" Ethan pointed towards Mark, who was standing a few feet away, talking loudly to a group of his friends. He was holding an empty glass, his expression a mixture of anger and disgust. He got mad," Ethan stammered, his voice trembling. Hey. Before Ethan could finish his sentence, Mark turned towards them, his face flushed with anger. "He spilled juice all over my new suit," he exclaimed, his voice raised above the music. "This is $1,000 suit, and this little brat ruined it." Sarah stood up, her protective instincts kicking in. "Mark, it was an accident," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "He's just a child." "He's a nuisance," Mark retorted, his eyes narrowed. "He's always in the way, always causing trouble. He needs to learn to be more careful." Before Sarah could respond, Mark raised his hand and slapped Ethan across the face. The sound, sharp and shocking, cut through the music and the chatter. The dance floor seemed to freeze, the music faltering as everyone turned to stare at the scene unfolding before them. Ethan cried out, more in shock and fear than in pain. He stumbled backward, his hand covering his cheek, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah was stunned, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. She stared at Mark, her eyes filled with horror and disbelief. The man she had married, the man she had thought she loved, had just struck her son. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The joy of the wedding day, the happiness she'd felt just moments before, evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, hard knot of fear and rage. She didn't scream, didn't shout. She simply stared at Mark, her silence more damning than any words could have been. The room remained silent, the guests frozen in place, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, disapproval, and pity. Carol, her best friend, was the first to react. She rushed to Ethan's side, putting her arm around him and shielding him from Mark. "Get away from him," Carol hissed at Mark, her voice trembling with anger. "You monster." Mark, momentarily taken aback by the sudden shift in the atmosphere, seemed to deflate. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a flicker of something that might have been shame, or perhaps just fear of the consequences. But the damage was done. The slap, a single, brutal act of violence, had shattered the illusion of the perfect wedding, the perfect marriage, the perfect life. It had revealed Mark's true character, a character that was far from the charming, attentive man Sarah had fallen in love with, and it had forced Sarah to confront a reality she had been desperately trying to avoid. She had made a terrible mistake. She had married a man who was capable of hurting her child, a man who was a danger to both of them. And now, she had to figure out what to do about it. The dream was over. The nightmare had begun. The immediate aftermath of the slap was a blur of confusion and raw emotion. Sarah, still reeling from the shock, knelt beside Ethan, cradling him in her arms. He was sobbing, his small body trembling. "Mommy," he cried, his voice muffled against her dress. He hit me." "I know, sweetie," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I know. I'm so sorry. I'm so So sorry. She rocked him gently, trying to soothe him, but her own body was shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. She couldn't believe what had just happened, couldn't believe that the man she had married, the man she had trusted, had just committed such a violent act against her son. Carol, her best friend, stood beside her, her face a mask of fury. "Sarah, you need to get him out of here," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Take him home. I'll deal with Mark." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She stood up, lifting Ethan into her arms. He clung to her, his face buried in her neck. She walked through the stunned crowd, her head held high, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't look at Mark, didn't acknowledge the whispers and stares of the guests. She just wanted to get her son away from this place, away from this man, away from this nightmare. As she reached the exit, her brother, John, intercepted her. He'd witnessed the entire scene, and his face was grim. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Are you okay? Do you need me to drive you home?" Sarah nodded, grateful for his support. "Yes, please, John," she managed to say. I just need to get Ethan home." John helped her into his car, and they drove away from the country club, leaving behind the shattered remnants of her wedding day. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken emotions, punctuated only by Ethan's occasional sobs. Sarah held Ethan close, stroking his hair, trying to reassure him that he was safe. But she herself felt anything but safe. She felt vulnerable, exposed, and utterly terrified. When they arrived at her house, Sarah put Ethan to bed, staying with him until he finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the emotional ordeal. She then went into the living room, where John was waiting for her. "Are you okay, Sarah?" he asked gently. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, John," she said. "I'm not okay. I don't know what to do." John sat beside her, putting his arm around her. "You did the right thing, Sarah," he said. "You got Ethan out of there. That's all that matters right now." "But what about Mark?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What am I going to do?" "Don't worry about Mark right now," John said. "You need to focus on Ethan, and on yourself. You need to figure out what you want to do, what's best for both of you." Sarah spent the rest of the night in a daze, her mind racing, her emotions in turmoil. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. She just sat there, staring into space, trying to make sense of what had happened. She knew she couldn't go back to Mark. She couldn't stay in a marriage with a man who was capable of such violence. She had to protect Ethan, and she had to protect herself. But she also felt a sense of overwhelming fear. She was alone, with a young child to care for. She had no job, no income, no support system other than her family and friends. She was terrified of the future, of the challenges that lay ahead. But amidst the fear, there was also a flicker of determination, a spark of resilience. She was a mother, and she would do whatever it took to protect her son. She would find the strength to overcome this, to build a new life for herself and for Ethan. She would not let Mark's actions define her, or her son's future. She would survive this. She had to. The next few days were a blur of activity. Sarah, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce determination to protect Ethan, began to seek support from various sources. Her first call was to Carol, her best friend. Carol had been a rock throughout the entire ordeal, offering unwavering support and practical advice. She'd already contacted a lawyer, a friend of hers who specialized in family law, and arranged a meeting for Sarah. "Don't worry, Sarah," Carol reassured her. "You're not alone. We're all here for you, and we're going to make sure that bastard doesn't get away with this." Sarah also reached out to her family. Her brother, John, continued to be a source of strength, offering to help with childcare and financial assistance. Her parents, initially shocked and dismayed by the situation, rallied around her, offering their unconditional love and support. She also confided in a few close friends from her church, women she'd known for years. They offered prayers, comfort, and practical help, organizing meals and offering to babysit Ethan. The meeting with the lawyer, a woman named Susan Miller, was both daunting and empowering. Susan listened patiently as Sarah recounted the events of the wedding day, her voice trembling with emotion. She then explained Sarah's legal options, outlining the process for obtaining a restraining order, filing for divorce, and seeking child custody. "The most important thing right now is to ensure your safety and Ethan's safety," Susan said. "We can file for a temporary restraining order immediately, which will prevent Mark from contacting you or Ethan." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The thought of Mark having any access to Ethan terrified her. She agreed to proceed with the restraining order, signing the necessary paperwork with a shaky hand. Susan also explained the process of filing for divorce, outlining the legal requirements and the potential challenges. She warned Sarah that Mark might fight for custody of Ethan, despite his violent behavior. "We'll need to gather evidence," Susan said. "Witness statements, photographs, anything that can support your claims. We'll also need to address the issue of financial support, both for you and for Ethan." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the legal complexities, but she also felt a sense of empowerment. She was taking control of her situation, fighting for her rights and for her son's well-being. She also sought professional help for Ethan, arranging for him to see a child therapist. Ethan was still withdrawn and anxious, struggling to process the trauma he'd experienced. The therapist, a kind and gentle woman named Dr. Evans, assured Sarah that Ethan was resilient and that with time and support, he would heal. "It's important for him to have a safe space to express his feelings," Dr. Evans said. "He needs to know that he's not to blame, that what happened was not his fault." Sarah also considered attending a support group for women who had experienced domestic violence. She'd initially resisted the idea, feeling ashamed and embarrassed by her situation. But she realized that she needed to connect with other women who understood what she was going through, who could offer support and encouragement. The support group proved to be a lifeline. She met women from all walks of life, women who had endured similar experiences, women who had survived and thrived. They shared their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. They offered each other practical advice, emotional support, and a sense of community. Sarah began to feel less alone, less isolated. She realized that she wasn't the only one who had been fooled by a charming facade, who had fallen for a man who turned out to be violent and abusive. She learned that she wasn't to blame, that she didn't deserve what had happened to her. She also learned about the cycle of abuse, the patterns of behavior that characterized abusive relationships. She recognized many of those patterns in her relationship with Mark: the initial charm and attentiveness, followed by increasing control, criticism, and ultimately, violence. The support group gave her the strength to face the challenges ahead, to confront Mark, and to fight for her freedom. She was no longer the naive, trusting woman who had walked down the aisle just a few weeks earlier. She was a survivor, a warrior, a mother determined to protect her child. She was learning to reclaim her power, to rebuild her life, and to create a safe and loving home for Ethan. The confrontation with Mark was inevitable. He'd been bombarding her with phone calls and text messages, alternating between apologies, threats, and pleas for reconciliation. Sarah had ignored them all, adhering to the terms of the restraining order. However, she knew she needed to speak with him, to formally inform him of her decision to file for divorce and to discuss the arrangements for Ethan. She arranged to meet him at a neutral location, a public park, with Carol present as a witness and support. Mark arrived looking disheveled and agitated. He hadn't shaved, his clothes were wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot. He clearly hadn't been sleeping well. "Sarah, you need to come to your senses," he began, his voice pleading. "This is all a misunderstanding. I made a mistake, I admit it. But it was just one mistake. I love you. I love Ethan. We can work this out." Sarah remained calm, her voice firm. "Mark, what you did was not a mistake. It was an act of violence against a child, my child. And I will never forgive you for that." "But I was drunk," Mark protested. "I wasn't myself. I would never intentionally hurt Ethan." "That's not an excuse, Mark," Sarah said. "Being drunk doesn't give you the right to hit a child. And it doesn't change the fact that you did it." "Please, Sarah," Mark begged. "Give me another chance. I'll go to anger management. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pity. She saw the desperation in his face, the fear of losing everything. But she also saw the underlying anger, the controlling personality that she'd ignored for so long. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said. "But it's over. I'm filing for divorce. And I'm seeking full custody of Ethan." Mark's face contorted with rage. "You can't do that," he shouted. "He's my son too. I have rights." "You forfeited your rights when you hit him," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "I will not allow you to have any contact with Ethan until a court decides otherwise. And I will fight you every step of the way to ensure his safety." Mark began to threaten her, his voice rising in volume. He accused her of being manipulative, of using Ethan to get back at him, of trying to ruin his life. Carol stepped forward, her voice firm and authoritative. "Mark, that's enough," she said. "You need to leave. You're violating the restraining order. If you don't leave now, I'll call the police." Mark glared at Carol, then at Sarah. He opened his mouth to say something, then seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, his anger deflated. Sarah watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The confrontation had been difficult, but she'd stood her ground. She'd spoken her truth, and she'd made it clear that she would not be intimidated. She knew the battle was far from over. She would have to face Mark in court, endure his legal challenges, and fight for her son's future. But she was prepared for that. She had the support of her family and friends, the guidance of her lawyer, and the strength of her own convictions. She was no longer the woman who had blindly trusted Mark, who had ignored the warning signs, who had allowed herself to be swept away by a whirlwind romance. She was a stronger, wiser, more resilient woman, a woman who knew her own worth, and who would never again allow anyone to hurt her or her child. She had faced the monster, and she had survived. And now she was ready to fight for her freedom and for Ethan's future. The decision to divorce Mark was the most difficult one Sarah had ever made, but it was also the easiest. There was no question in her mind that she could not remain married to a man who had physically abused her son. The only question was how to navigate the process, how to protect Ethan, and how to rebuild their lives. The legal proceedings were daunting. Mark contested the divorce, fighting for custody of Ethan and demanding a significant portion of their shared assets. He hired a high-powered lawyer, a man known for his aggressive tactics and his willingness to bend the rules. Sarah, with Susan Miller's guidance, prepared for a long and arduous court battle. They gathered evidence of Mark's abusive behavior, including witness statements from the wedding guests, photographs of Ethan's bruised cheek, and a police report filed after the incident. They also documented Mark's history of controlling behavior, his verbal abuse, and his attempts to isolate Sarah from her friends and family. They presented a compelling case, painting a picture of a man who was unfit to be a parent. Mark, in turn, tried to portray Sarah as an unstable, manipulative woman who was using the incident to gain an advantage in the divorce. He claimed that he'd simply tapped Ethan on the cheek, that it was an accident, that Sarah was exaggerating the situation. The court hearings were emotionally draining for Sarah. She had to relive the trauma of the wedding day, to face Mark's accusations, and to endure the scrutiny of the legal system. But she remained strong, her focus unwavering on protecting Ethan. Ethan, meanwhile, was struggling to adjust to the changes in his life. He missed his old routine, his friends, and even the familiarity of his former home. He was also dealing with the emotional aftermath of the slap, the fear and confusion that lingered long after the physical pain had subsided. Sarah did everything she could to support him. She enrolled him in therapy, spent extra time with him, and reassured him that he was safe and loved. She also made sure he maintained contact with his grandparents, his Uncle John, and his cousins, providing him with a sense of stability and normalcy. The judge overseeing the case, a woman named Judge Thompson, was thorough and compassionate. She listened carefully to both sides, reviewed the evidence, and interviewed Ethan in a private, child-friendly setting. After several weeks of hearings, Judge Thompson issued her ruling. She granted Sarah a divorce, awarded her sole custody of Ethan, and ordered Mark to pay child support and alimony. She also restricted Mark's visitation rights, allowing him only supervised visits with Ethan, and mandating that he attend anger management therapy. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't a complete victory. She knew the emotional scars would take time to heal, but it was a significant step towards securing Ethan's safety and well-being. She looked at Ethan, who was sitting beside her in the courtroom, his small hand holding hers. She squeezed his hand, offering him a reassuring smile. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered. "We're going to be okay." Ethan smiled back, a tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. He trusted his mother, and he knew that she would always protect him. The decision was made. The legal battle was over. But the real work, the work of healing and rebuilding, was just beginning. Sarah knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face the challenges ahead, hand in hand with her son. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. With the court order in hand, Sarah began the process of rebuilding their lives. The first step was to find a new home. She couldn't bear the thought of returning to the house she'd shared with Mark, a place filled with too many painful memories. With the help of her brother, John, she found a small, cozy apartment in a safe neighborhood, close to Ethan's school and within walking distance of a park. It wasn't as spacious or luxurious as their previous home, but it was filled with light, warmth, and a sense of security. Sarah and Ethan spent several days decorating their new apartment, choosing pink colors, arranging furniture, and hanging pictures. They worked together, laughing, talking, and slowly transforming the empty space into a home. Ethan, initially hesitant about the move, began to settle into his new surroundings. He made friends with the children in the neighborhood, joined a local soccer team, and started to excel in school. He was still seeing Dr. Evans, the therapist, but his anxiety was lessening, and his stutter was becoming less frequent. Sarah, meanwhile, began to explore her own interests and passions. She'd always loved to paint, but she'd put her artistic pursuits on hold during her marriage to Mark. Now, with more time and freedom, she enrolled in an art class at the local community center. She found solace in creating, in expressing her emotions through colors and brushstrokes. She painted landscapes, portraits, and abstract images, each canvas a reflection of her journey, her struggles, and her triumphs. She also started volunteering at a local women's shelter, offering support and encouragement to women who had experienced domestic violence. She shared her story, her experiences, and her insights, helping other women find the strength to leave abusive relationships and rebuild their lives. She found that helping others was a powerful way to heal herself. It gave her a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of connection to something larger than herself. She also made an effort to reconnect with old friends, women she'd neglected during her marriage to Mark. She apologized for her absence, explained her situation, and asked for their forgiveness. Most of her friends were understanding and supportive, welcoming her back into their lives with open arms. They offered her friendship, laughter, and a sense of belonging. Sarah was slowly but surely building a new life for herself and for Ethan, a life based on love, respect, and genuine connection. She was no longer defined by her past, by her failed marriage, by the trauma she'd endured. She was defined by her strength, her resilience, her courage, and her unwavering love for her son. She was taking action, not just in the legal sense, but in every aspect of her life. She was reclaiming her power, her independence, and her happiness. She was creating a future that was bright, hopeful, and filled with possibilities. She was a survivor, and she was thriving. Years passed. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined Sarah or Ethan. They had built a life filled with love, laughter, and a deep sense of peace. Ethan, now a teenager, was a confident, well-adjusted young man. He excelled in school, played sports, and had a close circle of friends. He still remembered the slap, of course, but it no longer haunted him. He'd learned to process his emotions, to cope with his trauma, and to move forward with his life. He had a healthy, respectful relationship with his mother, built on mutual trust and understanding. He knew he could always count on her, that she would always be there for him, no matter what. Sarah had continued to pursue her artistic passions, her paintings becoming increasingly popular. She'd even had a few exhibitions at local galleries, her work receiving critical acclaim. She'd found a new sense of confidence, a new sense of self-worth that had been missing for so long. She'd also found love again, not in a whirlwind romance, but in a slow, steady friendship that blossomed into a deep and meaningful relationship. She met Michael, a kind, gentle man who worked as a librarian, at a book club meeting. Michael was everything Mark wasn't: patient, understanding, supportive, and respectful. He adored Ethan, and Ethan adored him. He didn't try to replace Ethan's father, but he offered him friendship, guidance, and a positive male role model. Sarah and Michael eventually married, in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by their family and friends. It wasn't a lavish affair like her first wedding, but it was filled with genuine love, laughter, and a sense of profound happiness. Ethan, standing beside his mother as her best man, gave a heartfelt speech, expressing his love and gratitude for her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to his well-being. He also welcomed Michael into their family, thanking him for making his mother so happy. Sarah looked at her son, her heart overflowing with pride and love. He'd grown into such a remarkable young man, despite the challenges he'd faced. He was a testament to the power of love, the power of resilience, and the power of healing. She looked at Michael, her new husband, her partner, her friend. He smiled at her, his eyes filled with love and admiration. She knew she'd found a good man, a man who would cherish her, respect her, and support her in all her endeavors. She looked around at her family and friends, the people who had stood by her through thick and thin, who had offered her their unwavering support and encouragement. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for their presence in her life. The healing was complete. The new beginning had truly begun. Sarah had emerged from the darkness of her past, stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. She had faced her demons, conquered her fears, and created a life that was filled with love, joy, and purpose. She had learned that even in the face of unimaginable trauma, it was possible to heal, to rebuild, to find happiness again. She had learned that the love of a mother for her child was the strongest force in the world, a force that could overcome any obstacle, conquer any fear, and create a future filled with hope. The slap, a moment of unimaginable cruelty, had ultimately led to a life of profound strength and unwavering love. And that was a victory worth celebrating.